Hi, this is Jeffrey Tucker, and you're listening to the Libertarian Christian Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. You might also consider supporting this podcast by sharing it and even donating. LCI needs your help so it can continue creating great content.
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. I'm Doug Stewart, and today I have a special guest with us to talk about his book, Dr. John Schneider. John Schneider is Professor Emeritus at Calvin and on Faculty of Philosophy at Grand Valley State University. He holds an MA in Historical and Systematic Theology from Fuller Theological Seminary and a PhD in Divinity from the University of Cambridge. He is the author of the book, The Good of Affluence, Seeking God in a Culture of Wealth, and that is the book he is here to talk about us today. John, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks.
So your book was actually published a few years ago. I've actually had it on my shelf for a few years, and I'm like, man, I really want to read that. And my initial, just reading the cover, not really knowing, not really diving into the book so much, I actually thought the book was just some justification for why it's okay to be a wealthy person. And, in the midst of political climate where being rich is often, disdained by those on the left and those on the right don't really talk much about it, I didn't find it it wasn't urgent for me to read it, but I picked it up this year and I started reading it, and I was just engaged the whole way through. And I just loved what you had to say about wealth and about culture and capitalism and what it means for Christians to be, in the world. So one of the things that kind of started off in your book was that capitalism isn't just an economic system, but there's a culture to it. So what do you mean by there's a culture to capitalism or a culture of affluence? Why is affluence the best word to use here?
Oh, that's a great question. By the way, I'm very glad that you think the book is still relevant. It came out numerous years ago. And I do think that some of the points in the book still stand as worth considering. As for your question, I think it's sometimes overlooked that capitalism isn't just a set of points about economics, as some people present it as being. At least it has come to represent a kind of culture that has certain features. And one of the features is that most of the people in cultures of capitalism, so-called, are affluent by any historical or contemporary world standard.
And that goes for a lot of people, not just those who we think of as affluent, like the Jeff Bezos of the world, or even, kind of middle-class business owners.
That's right. And that experience, I wrote the book, and the book came out, I think, in 2004, has only increased as we see rising middle classes in places like Brazil, India, of course, China, and elsewhere, in ways that nobody, it would be hard to find people that envisioned this kind of development 20 years ago I guess it was 2004 when I published the book. But when I published the book, I was just sort of predicting. I don't want to take credit for this, but predicting that things like this would happen. Yes. Societies would adopt certain kinds of legal and political changes. I had predicted a lot of the great things that happened after 2004 in China, India, Brazil. What we have seen is kind of an unheralded and massive transition from trade commodity-based economy worldwide to manufacturing-based economy.
Yeah, I mean, it's been remarkable in a decade and a half, the amount of poverty that has been reduced, and yet through markets, and that's pretty. Yeah, like I said, it's really remarkable, and there's a lot of Christians out there who are. I don't know what alternate story they have for why India and China and much of the developing world, and now soon Africa has risen out of poverty or fast rising out of poverty. But there seems to be a bias against wealth, whether it's having wealth or whatever. I think maybe they just think of wealth as money. I mean, what's so bad about wealth? I mean, yeah.
I'm sorry, I keep jumping in here.
No problem.
When people say, quote, wealth, they aren't thinking of themselves. They're thinking of really, really wealthy people whose material wealth exceeds the norm by a lot. And they don't realize that what's happened really almost miraculously in the last 25 or so years is that the world has increased its, quote, wealth to the point where an awful lot of people are wealthy in the sense that they have more than they need for basic sustenance. It wasn't that long ago that we were preoccupied with places like Bangladesh, and I can go back into the 70s and 60s, where we had massive areas of the world in which people were starving, children and everyone utterly cut off from any sort of sustenance. So it's pretty amazing that an awful lot of that, if not all of that, has been addressed. And, whether people want to admit it or not, it's been addressed pretty much by countries that have adopted versions of market capitalism with a surplus of wealth that they've produced.
Yeah. There seems to be this tension with people like on the Christian left who sort of eschew wealth on the one hand, yet they need that wealth to address the poverty concerns. I mean, they always think of it through means of redistribution, but somehow we need the wealth of Jeff Bezos and et cetera in order to like solve poverty. Like the memes on Facebook are, the top 5 richest people made enough profit to end poverty 10 times this year or something along those lines. But one of the things that I appreciated about your book was that it was deeply theological. It wasn't just some, and I think these books are necessary. It's not really a defense of capitalism per se, although you assume its goodness to a large extent. It isn't one of those like, well, look at what capitalism has done for us. And it's really you pretty much went through the whole Bible and said, this is what God's vision for humanity was all about. Could you give us a little taste of what that is? I want people to buy your book, so you can't give away everything. Plus we don't have time to, but where does it start?
Well, where does it start? I like to start with the Old Testament, although a lot of Christians, sometimes overlook the Old Testament and don't realize just how important it is as a context for the New Testament. But there's a very strong emphasis on the goodness of the material realm in the Old Testament, beginning with the creation story. And you have to be careful with that because you don't, at least I don't, want to support certain views about the importance of prosperity. I don't think prosperity is guaranteed to people of faith. But prosperity is understood throughout the Old Testament as a very good thing. And it might come through, faith, or it might not. But in the end, prosperity, material prosperity, the flourishing, the well-being of all creatures and things is the promise of Christianity from the Old Testament to the New. And so I'm interested in this book and perceiving how that theme might intrude upon our own particular ethics and approach to uniquely American lifestyle in a culture of wealth.
Back when your book was written, I was reading a lot of books that were kind of, I would say they're like Christian environmental treatises, maybe not the whole book, but like parts of it were trying to say that, we need to take care of creation. And what they were doing was saying that, be fruitful and multiply was a completely abused verse by the people who, ravaged North America by colonizing it and just didn't take any concern for the environment because, we can do whatever we want to the world. And so there's a lot of sort of there's a lot of Christian sentiment against dominion theology. Are they just misunderstood, misguided? Surely we can judge a little bit about what people did in the past and that they didn't, take care of the environment as well as they ought to have. But that doesn't mean we should abandon it altogether, does it?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by dominion theology. Can you explain it a little more?
Yeah,
I know about the Reconstructionist definition of dominion theology. Is that the one you're using?
Well, just the idea that in Genesis, God tells Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply and to have dominion over the earth, and it has been pretty well. I would say on the Christian left, especially, they have pretty much outcried against the previous interpretations of that verse that says, well, we can conquer lands and we can do whatever we want because God says be fruitful and multiply, and we can't harm the environment, we can't do anything wrong, we're on the top of the food chain. And so there was this very like cavalier attitude by those who interpreted it, took it very, very seriously. And it seemed like in your book that you see the be fruitful and multiply, command in a more theological sense, not destructive, but more actually an improvement of the world.
Right. I think the term dominion is really loaded. It's used in Genesis, and as you know from reading my book, you take it. You see that I take it very seriously. In that the imago Dei, or image of God, in Genesis means that human beings have dominion over not only the creatures of the world, but the entire earth. That's the idea. And so naturally, there's a lot of skepticism about whether that biblical, if it is biblical, mandate for human dominion is a good thing or bad thing. And I try to explain how it's both, in a sense. It's properly understood a very good thing. In that human dominion entails care for the creation, not exploitation and destruction. That's of course, a long subject, but I think there's just a lot of stuff here that is in need of serious discussion and bringing out that hasn't been done yet.
The other thing that, once you come out of Genesis, we get into Exodus, and you see the primary narrative or a motif of liberation theologies has been the Exodus. And, if anybody has read a liberation theologian talk about what the gospel is about, they're going to, kind of preclude that by going back to Exodus and saying that God is the kind of God who pulls people out of bondage, who pulls people out of the oppression that they're in. And, eventually there's a little bit of Marxism that gets infiltrated into that theology.
Right.
But there is a motif of liberation.
Right.
You say that there's a lot of things that people miss when they read the Exodus narrative from the liberation standpoint.
Right. Right.
So what are some things that we can learn from the Exodus that gives us sort of the foundation that this culture of affluence, we might call it capitalism, but that there's this culture around affluence, and that it's okay that there is a prosperity that is to be had that's balanced and healthy?
Well, I think the good thing there is that, those texts, the so-called Jubilee texts and so on, the Holiness Code in Leviticus very strongly support an attitude that we should, all of us, any person committed to Christianity, committed to Judaism, Christianity, or anything formed by these kinds of texts, should be strongly sensitive to the conditions of the poor, and, all kinds of senses in which we should try to help people in those awful states of economic being.
Mm-hmm.
But to take these texts as a basis for socialism is a really bad mistake, as I explain in the book. It's pretty obvious, really. They're not about the state control of economies in the sense that socialism is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's kind of unfortunate that texts like this that are tremendously humane have often been incorporated by liberation theologians as a basis for socialism in a state-controlled sense. It's just unfortunate. I mean, these texts just don't support that kind of move, really. You have to support that kind of move in other ways, and unfortunately, those other ways don't work either.
Yeah, right. Well, one thing that is true about the Exodus is also that God made a promise to Israel that was their own land where there would be prosperity. If it seems to me that if God wants everyone to be poor, which is sometimes what some people think, is that there's this sort of like, blessing in being poor. And I don't mean that there isn't the blessing in being poor, but that's something that we ought to strive for is, this asceticism. That why would God want to liberate people if that's the case? Like, why wouldn't God just show up and be specially present with slaves and show his presence in that way? But instead there is, nope, that's not where you ought to be. You ought to be in your own land.
Okay. Well, my view is that the use of these texts, where God empowers and makes Israel prosperous, is badly misused by prosperity gospel people.
Mm-hmm.
Who say, oh, no, we can expect God to do the same thing for us if we're just faithful.
Right, and that's not the case at all.
And all of that might happen, and does happen. I think the point of those texts is that in an afterlife, that is exactly the vision that God has for all human and non-human beings. That there will be, in the next life, a great flourishing of people and non-human beings. But to think that these promises apply only to the experience of people prior to death is really to mislead them, and not just to mislead them, but to do so in a way that is very damaging.
Mm-hmm.
This is a point where I think my book has been misunderstood by a lot of folks. I don't chime in at all with the so-called prosperity gospel. In fact, I think the prosperity gospel, so far as I understand it, is really bad, really unfortunate and damaging in that way. So I would want to make sure that people don't hear me and see me saying anything that supports it.
Yeah, I found it interesting. You said before we went on air that the book was a little bit written off by people who thought it was sort of promoting that.
Right, exactly. I got terrible reviews from some people for that reason, and it's just not true. Really.
I almost wonder if those people even read the book.
They didn't. No, I have one reviewer, and I'm going to say it was the Christian Century, which is a pretty major publication, where they invited someone to review the book.
Uh-huh.
Her name is Lillian Daniel. Very nice person and all that, but she clearly had not read past the introduction of the book before she reviewed it. It's clear. So, there you go. That
Yeah,
gives
that's
you some
pretty
idea
unfortunate.
as to how blocked off certain people are to the proposition that affluence is a good thing. That the kind of affluence that capitalism can create can be a very good thing.
Yeah.
And it can be good in a Christian sense, not just in the utilitarian sense. Those are things that need to be thought about seriously, and not just written off as letting rich people off the hook, as if rich people, of course, are necessarily bad, which is clearly also false.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's evidence that when you have a book, and I can understand maybe if all they read were the title, that maybe that's where the book was. I mean, that's sort of where I kind of assumed it was, but I mean, it was very early on where...
You did. It's from the title.
What's that?
Just from the title, that's what you assumed?
Seeking God in a Culture of Wealth.
I'm not, the interesting thing for me is that I went back and forth with my publisher about the title, and that's the one they liked the best.
Uh-huh.
And I thought, well, maybe we should have a title that protected me a little bit more from that assumption. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, I think I didn't know what the word affluence really meant until I read the book, which is unfortunate because I thought the word affluent, of course, it didn't say, the title is The Good of Affluence, not The Good of Being Affluent. And so you can misread the title. So I did. I misread the title, and that's a danger, of course.
Very astute point.
So it's all on me that I sort of made the wrong assumption. But
well, not really. I mean, if you made the wrong assumption, no, honestly, if you made the wrong assumption, there may be something to blame in the labeling.
Well, maybe, but even so,
I've frankly been very embarrassed by being associated with a view that supports people I don't support, namely many people who are promoting policies that hurt ordinary folks and so forth. And so the last thing I wanted was for my book to be associated with support of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so the important maybe the book needs to be retitled.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's a good title once I know what's in it. Maybe, yeah, I don't know. I mean, the thing is for me, I read a book like that and I've read it, of course, and I read every bit of it. I don't read every book that I read. Sometimes I skip the last chapter, or there might be a few chapters where I, gloss over a bit. But this was one that I wanted to read every paragraph. And it's very interesting to me to hear that you were written off with it's a prosperity gospel leaning kind of thing. And I think it's evidence that a lot of people can't think beyond prosperity gospel on one side, or we need to be, really skeptical of wealth on the other. And, and in my head, I'm thinking, well, I kept it on my shelf knowing that I'm going to read this book someday for a few years, thinking, well, I don't have anything against affluence. I just didn't at the time, know exactly, what I was going to get out of the book. And then, of course, I pick it up this year and I'm amazed by it. So, but we've kind of gone through that. We were kind of going through the Bible a little bit here, and we were talking about the Exodus narrative and the kind of ways that people misunderstand, the Exodus narrative and what God promises. One of the things that is very prominent lately is to go to some of the prophetic texts and look at the prophetic tradition. And, the prophets were very anti-wealth on the one hand, if you read some things out of context, but what were they really teaching is the question. And you go into that in the book.
Well, can I make a mild correction to your statement?
Oh, sure.
Wasn't meant to be utterly precise. Because I don't think the prophets even remotely wanted to criticize wealth. The whole promise of the Messiah was that the Messiah would bring great wealth, right? And would do so in a way that would create an eternal kingdom. What the prophet opposed was the misuse of contemporary wealth. That is, if people became wealthy before the Messiah came, they had tremendously great responsibility to use their wealth and to employ their wealth in certain ways. So I'm wanting to emphasize that.
Yeah, so we're basically misreading the prophets by assuming that they were against wealth.
Well, they weren't even remotely against wealth. They were. I mean, there's nothing in the prophets against wealth. There's only against the use of power and wealth to exploit weak people. But the whole basis for that is, and context for that, is a tremendous affirmation of the goodness of wealth, which is inherent in the messianic promise of a kingdom of God. And it's described, of course, in the last chapters of Isaiah in the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, Jesus is, and I stress this in the book, is famous and notorious for not condemning wealth per se. Luke, I think, I make this argument in Luke, that what he condemns is a horrible approach to wealth when it happens. And of course, wealth in that context is a lot different than wealth as it is now.
Yeah, right.
But I think we can still make that bridge work.
Yeah, your take on Luke is very. I really like how you went through the book of Luke and talked about the misapplication, misunderstanding of what Jesus was doing and how it fit in with the prophetic tradition. I hope listeners can go and read that. That was almost worth the price of the book itself. Because
I'm going to say that as the writer of the book,
yeah,
I think the stuff on Luke and Acts is probably the best part of the book.
Yeah.
I wrote the book a long time ago, so you and I are discussing a book. Normally, we wouldn't be interviewing on a book that was written 15 years ago. But, no, it was. But the fact is, the book still has relevance.
It does, yeah.
Yes, but the thing is, if listeners are I think the sections on Luke and the New Testament are honestly worth the price of the book.
Yeah. Well, and it's not a super long book too, so it's neither expensive nor long. I mean, it's slightly over 200 pages in the copy that I have here, so it's like, it's not too terribly long.
Hey folks, Norman Horn here from LCI. Would you do us a quick favor and rank us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you subscribe to us? High rankings helps us get the word out there. And now let's get back to the show.
No, I think the relevance is because now we are hearing a lot of anti-wealth rhetoric coming from the political class, and I would say the only ammunition, so to speak, that Christians have are, not anecdotal or data driven by capitalism has gotten us, if you care about poverty, then capitalism is the ticket out, and global capitalism is creating that. And so we have that sort of, I wouldn't call it, it's an economic argument. It's an empirical argument, but libertarian Christians go in that direction with their justification for all good things that create wealth. Well, we have to have some sort of wealth creation mechanism. But there's also theological foundations. And, another thing, I actually know somebody who has created great wealth for themselves and for other people through the businesses that they run. And I do know that person actually struggled early on with being so successful at doing just what he knew to be good work. And yet somehow there's this unexpected prosperity, and they were like, well, is this right? I mean, is this, and the faith tradition that they grew up in was not prosperity gospel by any stretch. It was more in the pietist Anabaptist tradition, and wealth was something that you didn't deal with too strongly. And,
Doug, I know people, and back when I wrote the book, this was on top of the Clinton boom, so-called.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say that I know individuals who are dealing with more than $1 billion of that question.
Yeah.
What in the world do I do sitting on top of this like some dragon? And that's happening now again. I mean, a lot of folks don't want to acknowledge Trump, and I'm not commenting on Trump here, but what he has done is unleash another great big wave of wealth creation in parts of the economy. And people are just wondering, I mean, good people, just sort of, what do I do with this? I'm getting rich beyond my wildest dreams. Usually through investments. So now what?
Yeah.
How do you do this as a Christian? I mean, it doesn't do any good to just say, "Oh, wealth is bad." What do you even mean by that? And so that's where I stepped in.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it serves a good purpose there and relevance there. I mean, should all the billionaires of the world do what the early church did and share all things in common and sell everything they have and give to the poor? I mean, is that how we should interpret what happened in the early church?
And even the early church didn't do that. Luke is an Acts is fiction. It's a fictionalized, I think mostly fictionalized account of what happened. There probably were some people who liquidated their property and probably had good reasons to do it. But I don't know about all that. But you have, Paul. I mean, there's no. All the research shows that early Christianity was a middle class, was a fairly strongly property movement. I mean, it just goes on and on. I bring this out in the book, one chapter of the book that hasn't really gotten a lot of attention. It's just the chapter on the sociological nature of early Christianity, where I don't do anything original. I just pull together pretty well established social research, historical research on the nature of the first Christian communities, which were, I mean, if we can talk about a middle class in that context, that's what they were. They weren't poor in the sense that they didn't have basic means to basic necessities. They were, merchants and people in conditions very like the ones Jesus grew up in. If we can take the gospel seriously, he was, brought up in a home where they had pretty reliable income and stable economic existence. The idea that Jesus was poor is, I don't think, very defensible.
So the book we're talking about here is, we've said the title over and over here, The Good of Affluence, Seeking God in a Culture of Wealth, with Dr. John R. Schneider. It's under $20 on Amazon right now. You can get it on Kindle for about $12, and I highly encourage all of our listeners to go and download it or purchase it and read it and take your time with it. It is such a good read through. There's so much. I highlighted a lot. I always highlight in books, but this one I highlighted a lot because there were just a lot of really relevant things that sort of bolstered my faith in what good Christian theology is like, and not a lot of people take that take that approach on the idea of wealth. And everybody who does, I mean, even when you do it well, like you're doing it, John, it gets thrown to the wayside on prosperity gospel. But it's nothing like the prosperity gospel.
Thanks for making
at
that.
all.
Thanks for stretching that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's nothing like it. I mean, it's unfortunate because it's so important to do what you're doing in that and in there as well. And also, we didn't really talk about it here, but you do mention early on that there's this sort of running side commentary with the Ron Sider development of his Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger, and all the numerous republications that has undergone and how his views have evolved, apparently toward a little bit less inconsistent view. So The Good of Affluence, go and get it. But you have another book coming out, I think, in the near future. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you've written there?
Well, all I can say now is it's not official yet, but I'm hoping that the book I've been working on for about 5 years on Darwinism and the suffering of animals is related to the problem of evil and belief in God will be coming out. I hope in 2019, but I can't say for sure.
Yeah. Once you've written it, it's not in your control as to when it comes out.
Book written and pretty much ready to go. It's just a tough topic, like the one we've just been discussing. So,
yeah,
I hope that your listeners will read the book, The Good of Affluence. I think it's still worth reading. So thanks for putting me on here. And, we'll talk later about the other book in due course.
Yeah, we'll stay connected and do that. If I get any feedback from our listeners or even our readers, I'll be sure to pass along that feedback to you. Well, John, thanks for being with us.
Oh, I'm very glad to, and thanks a lot, Doug.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast. If you liked today's episode, we encourage you to rate us on Apple Podcasts to help expand our audience. If you want to reach out to us, email us at podcast@libertarianchristians.com. You can also reach us at LCI Official on Twitter. And of course, we are on Facebook and have an active group. You are welcome to join. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Libertarian Christian Podcast is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, a registered 501c3 nonprofit. The audio engineers were Doug Stewart and Jason Rink, and voiceovers were by Matthew Bellis and Caitlin Horn. If you'd like to find out more about the LCI, please visit us on the web at www.libertarianchristians.com.